Hi everyone, and welcome back to Carl Wesley Sewing Patterns. In this video, we're going to learn how to sew a zipper polo. I know it's been a while since I released a new pattern, but looking ahead at the end of winter and the beginning of some warmer weather, I wanted to make myself some new things. So let's get started. This pattern is available as a PDF download, and you will find a link to purchase it in the description below. If you're not familiar with how digital sewing patterns work, I also have another video you can check out on how to print and assemble them at home. Your fully assembled pattern will look something like this, and you will find an assembly diagram on the first printed page of your pattern. The sizes are differentiated by color, and the pattern was designed as a men's sewing pattern. However, for anyone else, plug in the chest or the bust measurement in the size chart and it should work out just fine. The sizing is for a close-fitting polo, so if you want a more relaxed fit, just size up. Let's talk about supplies. For fabric, you want to choose a stretchy, lightweight jersey knit that has spandex. You may want to pre-wash the fabric to prevent any shrinkage of the finished garment later. You may also want a small amount of contrasting fabric to use for the zipper facing. We also need some fusible woven interfacing, fusible knit interfacing, wash-away seam tape, a standard nylon coil zipper in either a contrast or complementary color. If it's a little long, we can shorten it. And some temporary fabric marking tools. I have tracing paper and tailor's chalk. The pattern pieces are as follows: the polo front, the polo back, the sleeve, the zipper facing, and the collar. A few important things to note. Pay attention to these markings, which indicate the fold of the fabric, and the long arrowed lines indicate either the greatest stretch of the fabric or the grain line. Finally, the small T's indicate notches, and you should place a tiny clip here with your scissors. Next, let's talk about cutting. I always recommend cutting stretchy jersey knit with a rotary cutter and weights so that things don't shift around. And I have my fabric laid out with two folds because the front and the back pieces are both cut on the fold. Don't forget to clip the notches because these will be used to match things later during the sewing. Make sure your tiny snips really are that, just tiny, so that they will disappear in the seam allowance. The sleeves are not cut on the fold, so I will lay out my fabric perfectly flat to cut those. This pattern has both a long sleeve and a short sleeve. The dashed line indicates where to cut for a short sleeve. Something to note here is that the sewing instructions are identical whether you choose the long sleeve or the short sleeve. And for this video, I'll be demonstrating a short sleeve polo. There are 3 notches on the top of the sleeve, so make sure to snip those with your scissors. We need to cut 1 collar on the fold of the fabric. Don't forget to snip the notches. Next, we need to cut 1 zipper facing out of fabric. I'm using a contrast fabric, but you can use your same matching jersey knit if you prefer. Next, let's move on to cutting our fusible woven interfacing. We need to cut 2 zipper facings out of this material, so I will fold it once and cut them both at the same time. Finally, we need to cut from the fusible knit interfacing. This is the kind of interfacing that has a little bit of stretch, and we will use this to cut a collar piece. The reason we are using 2 types of fusible interfacing will make a lot more sense a little bit later. After cutting, you should have these pieces: a zipper facing in fabric, 2 zipper facings in woven interfacing, 2 sleeves, 1 collar cut from fabric, and 1 collar cut from knit interfacing. You will also have 1 front and 1 back. Before we do any sewing, there's some prep work we need to do. On the front piece, we need to mark the dashed line indicating where the zipper facing will be stitched. I'm going to use a tracing wheel and tracing paper, and we need to mark both the front and back sides of the fabric. The tracing wheel will leave some little tick marks in the paper, so when you flip it over to the wrong side, you will be able to see the line to mark the other half of the front piece. If you transferred the marking correctly, you will have what looks like a long U shape coming from the neckline. Now we need to flip the fabric over and transfer the dashed line again to this side. Next, we need to fuse interfacing to the zipper facing using a hot iron. I suggest using a press cloth for any kind of ironing or fusing on projects that use stretch knit fabrics. The second piece of woven interfacing needs to be fused to the wrong side of the front of your polo. Use the tracing paper marking as a guide to place the interfacing. It's very important to make sure you fuse this on the wrong side and not the face side of the fabric. We don't want it to be visible on the outside of our shirt when we get finished, and if you fuse it wrong, you may not be able to get all the glue removed. We're using woven interfacing here instead of knit interfacing because we want to stabilize the area where we will place the zipper, and this will remove all the stretch from that area. It's extremely difficult or impossible to stitch a nice zipper on stretchy fabric, so I don't recommend attempting it without the fusible interfacing. Finally, we need to fuse the piece of knit interfacing to the collar. We're using knit interfacing here because we want to keep most of the stretch around the neckline. One optional step here is to fuse some narrow strips of interfacing along the shoulder lines of both the front and back pieces on the wrong side of the fabric. This step will help keep the shoulder seams from stretching out over time. There are some other methods of stabilizing shoulder seams, which I will let you research on your own, but this way I feel is the simplest. Next, using our tracing paper, we need to transfer the dashed lines on the zipper facing to the interfaced side of our fabric. The outside rectangle marks the stitching line for the zipper facing, and the center line marks the cut line, which will be used later. For our last bit of prep work, you may need to shorten your zipper. We want the zipper to be 7 inches from zipper pull to zipper stop. Measure down from the zipper pull and mark the new placement of the zipper stop with a piece of chalk. All you need to do to shorten the zipper is to zigzag over the coil where you want the new stop to be. Then cut off the excess zipper, leaving at least 1/2 an inch below the new stop. Now we're ready to begin sewing. Place the zipper facing right sides facing on the polo front. Use the line that you made with the tracing paper to guide the placement. Secure with pins around the outside of the facing. Now, using a straight stitch on the sewing machine, we will stitch the outside of the long rectangle that we marked with the tracing paper. Using a regular straight stitch, stitch directly on the line, pivoting at the corners. Take your time and stitch carefully here and through the whole zipper process because we don't want any crazy stitching around our zipper. Also, don't worry about the center line. We will deal with that in the next step. Don't forget to back tack at the start and stop of your stitching. You can see here when I flip it over what the stitching should look like. Next, remove the pins. At this point, before proceeding to the next step, you can finish the outside edge of the facing, but it isn't 100% required, especially if you used a knit fabric that doesn't ravel. Now, using your fabric scissors, very carefully cut the center line between the 2 rows of stitching. Once you get about 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom row of stitching, you will cut a little triangle out toward the pivot points, like I'm showing you here. Next, flip over your fabric, and then we're going to turn the facing so that it's on the wrong side of the polo front. If you're having a hard time getting the edge to be turned out fully, roll the 2 layers of fabric between your fingers a little bit. We want the facing to be pulled just slightly more toward the inside, and this step should completely cover the exposed interfacing. Once you're happy with the placement, start using pins to secure the outside edge of the facing. Next, get out your wash-away seam tape, which is my secret weapon for sewing zippers. Place it sticky side down along the open edges of the zipper facing. After that, you peel the paper off the wash-away seam tape, and that reveals a sticky edge where you can place your zipper. Now flip your fabric back over, and then we can place the zipper inside the window that we made. There's really no special trick here. Place the zipper with the stop just visible, and try to get the zipper as centered as possible. The wash-away seam tape is not so sticky that you can't unstick it and readjust if you need to. When you're happy with the placement, some pressure from your fingers will securely attach the zipper to the fabric. Now we will stitch down and around very close to the edge to attach the zipper to the fabric. Switch to your zipper foot for this step and try to stitch about 1 needle width away from the edge. Stitch slowly and carefully here because any bad stitching will be very obvious. You may need to place a folded up piece of fabric at the back of the presser foot to level it out. It's difficult to get your stitching started with the bulkiness of the fabric and the zipper. Use both hands to steer the fabric and keep it flat, and allow the sewing machine to pull the fabric through at its own pace. Sink the needle and pivot to go around the bottom. You may need to do some readjusting here to keep your stitching perfect. Next, repeat the process again, except this time you're going to stitch about 1/4 or 3/8 of an inch outside the first line of stitching. This step is optional, but it is decorative, and it does help keep the facing flat against the front of the polo shirt. Next, let's switch back to our regular sewing foot, and we will stitch down the flaps of the facing along the neckline. We can also cut off the bits of zipper that extend beyond the neckline. Place your stitching close to the edge so that this will disappear in a seam allowance later. The goal is to temporarily secure these flaps until they get stitched into the collar. Now let's take a look at the finished zipper. Something to note here is that I used contrasting thread for this entire video because it's easier to see on camera. However, it's probably a much better idea to use matching thread because it's much more forgiving and will hide any slight imperfections. Now with the zipper finished, it's time to do the shoulder seams. Place the front and the back right sides facing, matching the shoulder edges. The shoulder seams are stitched with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, as are all the other seams in this pattern. Let's head to the serger to stitch the shoulder seams. A 3/8 inch seam allowance on a serger is normally done by aligning the fabric edges with the right side of your sewing surface. It is possible to stitch this entire pattern with a standard sewing machine, but a serger will give you the most commercial look. Next, let's open up these seams and look at our shirt from the right side. An optional but highly recommended step at this point is to use your sewing machine and stitch the seam allowance down flat to the front of the shirt. I'm using a 3-step zigzag on my sewing machine, but a regular zigzag, cover stitch, or even a straight stitch would all work fine here. The idea here is to spread the front and the back pieces apart and secure the bulk of the seam allowance toward the front of the shirt. Use your fingers to feel through the layers to make sure that you're putting the seam allowance in the correct direction. Next, we will start working on the collar. Fold the collar in half, right sides facing, across the length. Then, we will use a straight stitch and a 3/8 inch seam allowance to close the short ends. Back tack at the start and stop of your stitching. Next, use your scissors to trim down the seam allowances that we just stitched, and also clip off the corners at the points of the collar. After that, turn the collar right side out and use a blunt point to press out the corners and the seam allowances. The collar is now assembled. You may want to press it just to crisp the edge. Before we attach the collar, you will want to use a piece of chalk and mark a line 3/8 inch from the open edge on one side. The line will be used as a guide later when we close the collar. Now, using sewing clips, we're going to start matching the unmarked edge of the collar to the neckline of the shirt. Start by matching the center of the collar to the center back of the neckline where there is a double notch. After that, walk the straight edge of the collar around the neckline and match the side seam of the collar with the open edge of the zipper. Repeat a second time with the other side of the collar. The next part is a little hard to explain, but you kind of want to equalize the fabric for the remaining open edges. It's easier to work the straight edge of the collar to match the curved line of the neckline. You will want to place several additional sewing clips here and make sure that everything is flat and there are no bunches in the fabric. Next, we will stitch the collar to the neckline using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. The stitch that I feel works best here is often referred to as a lightning bolt stitch, but a narrow zigzag stitch will work fine here as well. The important thing is that we select a stitch that will retain the stretch around the neckline. We want to open the collar up and start stitching directly where the seam edge of the collar matches the open zipper. As a reminder, we're only stitching one open edge of the collar to the neckline, and the other collar edge remains open. It's worth checking frequently as you stitch this seam to make sure that you don't catch any additional layers beyond the two that we're trying to sew together. Take your time to stitch slowly and carefully here. Here's a look from a different viewpoint. Continue stitching across until you get close to the opposite collar edge. When you get toward the other side, you will want to be mindful of trying to match the seam edge of the collar to the opening edge of the zipper. Back tack at the end of your stitching. Here is the result. You can see where I very closely matched the collar edge to the edge of the zipper. Take a moment here to make sure that you have only stitched 2 layers together and that there aren't any puckers in the fabric. Next, we're going to keep using the same stitch we just used, except this time we're going to stitch the seam allowance we just made to the collar, right along the seam line. If you're familiar with understitching a lining, this step is kind of similar to that. You won't be able to see it because it's on the underside, but make sure that the seam allowance is pressed towards the collar. You can feel through the fabric with your fingertips to make sure that it's laying in the right direction. Also, keep in mind here that one flap of the collar is still not attached. We are only stitching the seam allowance to the collar here. It works best if you spread the seam open with one hand on each side of the presser foot. You don't necessarily need to stitch the entire length of the seam, you just need to get close to the edges of the collar. This line of stitching will not show when the garment is worn, so it's not the end of the world if your stitching line isn't 100% perfect. From the back of the shirt here, you can see the line of stitching we just made close to the seam between the collar and the shirt. And from the front, you will see the extra line of stitching where we secured down the seam allowance. The seam allowance will now easily stay tucked up inside the collar when we stitch the collar closed. Next, using the chalk line we made previously as a guide, fold under the remaining open flap of the collar and use pins to secure it down just below the lower line of stitching. Place pins all along the length here to make sure that this is secure when we take it to the sewing machine. Using the same stitch as before, we will now start at one side of the collar and stitch it closed, very close to the fold edge of fabric. To get started here, you will probably need to place a folded up piece of fabric at the back of your presser foot to level it out to get started stitching over the bulk at the edge of the collar. Remove the pins as you approach them and try to stitch about 1 needle width away from the fold edge. Continue stitching across the collar until you reach the other side. Now the collar is finished. At this point, one optional step you can take is to continue stitching all the way around the edge of the collar to make a more commercial look. I'm going to switch to the triple straight stitch on my sewing machine here, but really any stitch that you like the look of will work fine, including a regular straight stitch. You will want to stitch about 1 needle width away from the edge, and keep it straight and neat as possible since it will be very visible on the finished garment. Let's take a look at the finished collar. With this step finished, the rest of the sewing of this polo is really pretty easy. Next, we will attach sleeves. Open up the front and back of the shirt so that you can see the entire curve of the armhole. You can see here how the sleeve cap is going to fit into this space. Starting at one point of the sleeve cap, place the fabric right sides facing and walk the sleeve cap around the edge of the armhole and match with sewing clips. There are 5 points you want to match, and this is the first one. The second point we want to match is the first notch. Next, we want to match the notch at the top of the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam line. Then there is a notch to match on the opposite side of the armhole. And then we have the final point, which is the underarm where the sleeve and the side of the shirt meet. One side note here is that the sleeve on this pattern is identical front and back, so as long as you place the fabrics right sides facing, you can't insert it wrong. This isn't always the case with other sewing patterns, and the back of the sleeve may be indicated by a double notch. At the serger, we will stitch onto the fabric at either matching point 1 or 5. I prefer to stitch with the sleeve cap toward the feed dogs on my serger. Stitching in sleeves can be tricky when you first do it, but I think the key here is to think about working the sleeve cap to the armhole instead of vice versa. The reason being that the sleeve cap is much more curved than the armhole. As a reminder, all the seam allowances on this pattern are stitched at 3/8 inch seam allowance or 1 centimeter. My method is to use my right hand to hold the top fabric and my left hand to hold the sleeve cap, which is underneath. As the fabric moves through the machine, the fingers of my left hand will pull in the sleeve cap to match the edge of the armhole on top. Remove the sewing clips as you approach them, and be mindful to match the notches as you stitch along this seam. Let's take a look at this step from a different angle. There are quite a few different tips and tricks on how to insert sleeves, so I encourage you to do some research online to find what works best for you. I cover sleeves in a little bit more detail in my t-shirt sewing tutorial, which includes a free pattern, and you will find that linked in the description. If you're still watching at this point, I'd also like to take a moment to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel if you find this video helpful. It takes me many hours to film and edit these tutorials, so those simple actions that you take help me continue to grow my channel. After stitching in your sleeve and before moving on to the next step, it's a good idea to take a look at the sleeve and make sure that it looks good. Repeat this process to attach the second sleeve before moving on. With both sleeves finished, the next step is to close the side seams. Fold the shirt in half, right sides facing, matching the underarm edge and side edges. Using several sewing clips along the length here will be helpful since this is a long seam. Also, make sure to match the seam at the underarm by placing the seam allowances in opposite directions and butting them up against each other. Stitch onto the fabric at the sleeve and sew in one continuous pass towards the hem using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. As a reminder, there is no difference in the assembly between the short sleeve and the long sleeve version of this pattern. Repeat this process to close both side seams. We're almost finished. The last thing we need to do is hem the bottom of the shirt and the sleeves. There are many different techniques for doing knit hems, but I'm going to show you the way I feel is the easiest. With the shirt turned inside out, use a piece of chalk to mark a line 2 inches above the raw edge. Mark this line on the sleeves as well as the bottom edge of the shirt. The hem allowance for this pattern is 1 inch. At this point, you may be wondering, why are we marking a line 2 inches from the raw edge if the hem allowance is 1 inch? The reason is because we need 1 inch of fabric on each side of the fold to create a 1 inch hem. The chalk line will be used as a guide. You will fold up the raw edge of fabric to meet this line. You can use pins to secure the fabric if you prefer, but I don't think it's completely necessary. Leave the shirt inside out and let's head to the sewing machine. My go-to stitch for hemming is a 3-step zigzag, but there are a number of different stretchy stitches you can use for hemming, including a standard zigzag. The hems will be stitched in the round. Start at the underarm seam for the sleeves and at a side seam for the bottom hem. Hold the raw edge of the fabric to meet the chalk line as you stitch. As you come all the way around, overlap your starting stitches by about 1/4 inch. Repeat this process to complete all the hems. Congratulations! The hems are the last step to complete your zipper polo. I hope you enjoyed this video from Carl Wesley Sewing Patterns. If you have any additional questions, please drop them in the comments below and I will respond as soon as I am able. I hope you will enjoy creating some new items for your wardrobe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.